But I want to say a couple words about almonds. They're kind of an amazing crop. They were a specialty crop. You can only grow them in some of the most deep, best soil in the world. Up in Chico, we call them almonds.
Almonds, they're still.
And so they're going back and forth with wine grapes now as the biggest crop in the state. 800,000 acres. It's one of these crops that we can grow in California. That's it's really hard to grow anywhere else. So we're really incredible producers. And I mean, we live our day-to-day lives and we have impact on the environment. Imagine what it's like to try to work with the earth and produce food for the marketplace and make enough money to do that and work with the environment. It's pretty amazing. And when you think of water and air and all the kinds of things they're going to tell you about that they deal with, it kind of is mind-blowing. And I've been on some of these modern almond farms, and it's amazing to see what the farmers are doing. They're working with water, they're working with air, they're working with the pesticides, they're working with all the resources in a way that is astounding. It's sort of like everything that we kind of think we want to have happen as regulators is already happening in the fields on some of these farms. And so Gabriele Ludwig is the Associate Director of the Environmental Affairs for the Almond Board. She's going to talk about her side of the story as far as air quality, water quality, all that good stuff. Bob Curtis. Yeah. Bob is the Associate Director of Agricultural Affairs. So they're dealing with everything from nitrogen to all the bees and all the things. And then Nick Gatzman. Yep. Nick is a farmer, and he's a professional pesticide PCA and business person, and he's going to tell his side of the story. And I think we'll start with Gabriele.
Just as Brian was saying, just to give you a sense of the almond industry or the almond growing, it's only in the Central Valley of California. It's 100% of U.S. production. So coming back to what Brian was saying, very unique environment here. There are about 6,500 growers and about 100, we call them handlers, but they're essentially the processors, the first people that take almonds and make them into something that you can eat. California grows about 80% of the world's production of almonds. It's the top U.S. horticulture crop in export value. I always say, and those who have heard me say this a couple of times, ag in general and almonds in particular are trying desperately to help reduce the trade deficit we have in this country. The farm gate value in 2012 was $4.8 billion, so a lot of value there nowadays. Briefly, the Almond Board itself, we're something called a federal marketing order. That means actually USDA has supervision over us, but the money for us comes from the growers and handlers. So 3 cents a pound pays for generic marketing globally, research programs, food quality and safety programs that the Almond Board does. But also realize that the decisions in the Almond Board are actually made by growers and handlers via the committee. So Nick is a member of the environmental committee that funds research projects in the environmental committee. So to give you an example. As probably most of you who've ever driven up and down the Central Valley have noticed, the acreage of almonds has gone up. It's doubled in about 20 years. Officially over 800,000 acres. And the yield per acre has also been going up. That's what you see in the upper slide. And that's coming back to the research and the production efficiencies that we'll talk a bit about more later. We are very export-focused, or crop that is export, but realize the United States is still by far the largest market. But then these are the top 10 individual country markets that we have.
Well, thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to come and help educate and help you guys learn about what we do as almond growers. We'll just start right here with how we start an orchard. There's a lot of different things to consider when we're going to plant an orchard. Remember, this is a 25-year investment that I'm going to put to the ground. All of our almond orchards last for at least 25 to 30 years. So whatever decisions we make now are going to impact us for a long, long time. So we want to make sure we do everything right. There's a lot of different varieties of almonds we can choose from, and climate and marketing and how well almonds pollinate each other go into decisions on what varieties we might plant. Almonds are also planted on different types of rootstocks. Different rootstocks do better in different types of soil, so we have to determine what rootstock is going to work best in our situation, to the soil conditions and to what soil pests or diseases that we might have. Spacing and irrigation system. We do lots of different types of spacings, narrow, wide, for different types of issues. You might plant an orchard with a little bit wider row to help with airflow, and really try and to get your tree population up, put trees kind of tighter down the row. Our equipment is getting bigger and bigger, so we need to make room for that. So we don't want to get our tree population too low and really spread our orchard out, so we might make our rows a little bit wider and put more trees down the row. Irrigation systems. Do we use a drip system? Do we use micro irrigation, solid set sprinklers? I think flood pretty much used to be the norm back in the old days. It's not anymore. We're 2/3 of the acreage is on some type of micro irrigation system, which we can really control how much water we put out very precisely. We can fertigate through our irrigation system very precisely. So it's a really precise way to grow our trees. No pushing water past the root zone, using all of our water as efficiently as possible. What soil pests need to be managed? This is a really, really big question. Like I said, this is a 25-year investment on our part. If you mess this part up and don't take care of your pests in the soil, you're going to be starting over again in about 4 or 5 years. The pests that we need to control on the soil are, in terms of pests, nematodes, but we also have diseases, ochre fungus, we have a replant disease, all of which need to be controlled. And we do that mostly through fumigation. We are starting to get a lot of orchards that are planted on virgin ground where we don't have that issue and we don't need to fumigate. But as we're planting on second, third, fourth generation orchards, this becomes a major issue. I've seen a lot of people mess up this part, not prepare their ground, not take care of soil pests, and the trees never get into production, and they're pulling them out in 4 or 5 years. Remember, I'm going to spend $3,000 to $4,000 just in the first year to get this orchard in and growing. I don't want to come back in 4 or 5 years and have to pull the thing out and start over. In 6 to 10 years, we're at full production. And like I said earlier, it's about a 25-year lifespan. That's an average. Right now, I've got a couple blocks that are 30 years old, but economically it's working for us right now because our commodity prices are good and we can afford to keep it in. The yields are dropping, but the market is sustaining us on those orchards.
So in terms of research that we have been funding, trying to deal with this, and it covers the full gamut from can we mitigate the emissions from fumigation through tarps, soil moisture, can we reduce the amount of fumigant by having site-specific, meaning GPS units along to make the planting just around where the tree's going to go. But there's also, from the biology, very little known on a lot of this, so also funding research just to get a better understanding of what is replant disease, because we don't know, and disease being just a part of the whole replant issue. In my dream, I would like to have better soil testing tools, because you can't do IPM unless you can test for it and figure out, do you have a problem A, and is the problem severe enough to do something? And then the Production Research Committee has been funding research on rootstock development pretty much since year 1, so that's almost 40 years of research in that area. If I had a magic wand, we could have GMO rootstocks to solve this problem. But for that, we need to have EU be willing to accept GMOs. So I just want to say, there's all these issues that tie in on this. As Nick just mentioned, there are multiple almond varieties. This just gives you a sense. This is something put together for the marketing side. They actually look different, and they are used in different ways. Nonpareil is the dominant variety. Most orchards will be 50% nonpareil and 25% one pollinizer and 25% another pollinizer. But just to realize that each orchard typically has 3 different varieties of almonds in it.
And they bracket up, they bracket the non-pro bloom or the major variety bloom.
I'm going to talk about insect and disease and IPM a little bit later, but we'll just kind of start talking about what the growing season looks like for us. Dormant spraying I'm going to get into later. It's a practice that we have really gotten away from or have really managed, and I'll go into detail about that later. Mummy removal for insect control. Probably don't know, when we harvest, we don't get all the almonds that are in the tree. Some of them stick there, okay? Those nuts are called mummy nuts. They stay on the tree over the winter, and they are a source of habitat for our major pest, navel orangeworm. Okay, so during the season, one of our main objectives during the winter time is to get those mummy nuts off the tree, get them on the ground, mow them up, destroy them, so we have a smaller population of navel orangeworm the following year. And later on when I talk about IPM, we'll get into that more. Pruning, wintertime is the time we get into pruning. There's been a lot of research whether that's necessary for yield increases. We still do prune at our ranches, but we're doing less and less of it. Now we're kind of pruning just to be able to make sure equipment can get through without getting tore up. We're pruning a little bit more for equipment and less for yield response. Runoff during rains, that's an issue. We're getting more into areas where we're planting on slopes, so we need to control sediment runoff. And also, if there was any, pesticides or anything applied, we have to take that into consideration when we're making our pest control decisions. In the late winter, early spring, over winter, we're worried about making our contracts with our beekeepers. I'm sure everyone's aware of the bee issues that are going on in the industry right now, and we're making sure that we are getting our bees in place and contracted with beekeepers, and to make sure that the bees that we've contracted are good and healthy. We spend 15 to 20% of our budget during bloom just on bees, between $300 and $400 an acre just to have a couple of hives per acre out there for us. Without the bees, we're not going to have a crop.
Just some comments about dormancies and research, and Nick has already mentioned navel orangeworm and how important sanitation is. It is the foundation or building block of navel orangeworm management. As we've gone through the years, we've become more sophisticated in terms of, we used to have one stagnant guideline, leaving no more than two mummies, as we call them, in the tree, but now we are developing, from predictive modeling and field work, a sliding scale, if you will, from south to north, and we're finding out that you really need to clean the trees lower than 2 leftover almonds per tree. In the south, too, you can tolerate a much higher level in the north because of rain, and also because there's not as much navel orangeworm pressure. A big milestone over the years for us, as Nick has said, is reduction in dormant sprays. It used to be back in the old days, everybody's made a dormant spray, and in particular with OPs. Well, during the 70s, the 80s primarily, it started off with the BIOS project, and then the pesticide, pest management alliances. I think we had 2 with you folks. Through this, we were able to show that we didn't need these dormant sprays habitually, and we reduced our dormant sprays 80% in the period of the 1990s.
And since we're talking to environmental regulators, I'm just letting you know the impact. So when in the San Joaquin Valley, the proposal was to ban burning of any of the prunings and chipping, tree removals, the Almond Board started to fund research, say, okay, what can we do with those prunings materials instead? And they assessed the impact of, if you chip the prunings and put them back on the orchard floor, what would that impact be on the soil quality? There were concerns it might introduce diseases, might worsen things. I think the reality of it is actually improves the soil quality, but that data was necessary. And in general, growers in the San Joaquin Valley adopted chipping before the deadline. So that was one of those win-win situations.
Okay, as was mentioned before, we have several varieties in each orchard, either 2 or 3 at least varieties, and that's needed because an almond is not self-fertile. It needs to pollinate with another variety. And so typically we have our main variety, nonpareil, as we talked about, and 1 or 2 other varieties. And those bees will go from flower to flower, from different variety to the other varieties, pollinating each other. And so we have trees that are blooming at different times, and one key thing when you're thinking about what varieties you want to plant, you need to make sure that their bloom overlaps so you can actually get pollen from one variety to the other. Diseases during bloom. almond blooms and emerging leaves get diseases, and we all know that during bloom time it's usually cold, wet, and rainy. And there's a myriad of different diseases we will get, and we have to prevent those at this time of the year. And so we do that with using fungicides. I'll go a little bit into pesticides and bee health later. Also during the spring we have a threat of frost. During bloom it has to get pretty darn cold, about 26 degrees to get any damage, but as those little nutlets grow after they're pollinated, it only takes about a half hour of 30 or 31 degree weather to wipe us out. So we need to mitigate frost during the spring all the way up till about May. Weed management. Weed management is a big issue with, it dovetails into frost control. If we have a lot of large weeds out in our orchard, it'll actually be colder out there. If we manage our weeds, have bare, firm, moist soil, we can actually keep the temperatures in the orchard up a little bit. And 1 degree can make a huge difference in our crop for the year.
There's a delicate dance and balance between our need for fungicides and bees. And I guess to cut to the chase on this, obviously the fungicides are needed, and we do spray them during bloom, but what we do know is that the bees are active in forage for pollen in the mornings, and the pollen, as a matter of fact, dehisces daily. So there's a new crop of newly emerged pollen. The bees go out and collect that. And then there is a period later on in the day, in the afternoon and evening, when the pollen and bees aren't present, and that's when we really need to focus on using that window for our fungicide spray, so we're not exposing the bees and the pollen to the fungicide. We're the 800-pound gorilla in the United States in terms of demand for bees. We use more than half of the bees in the United States, and probably more like 2/3. And obviously, bee health and the issues surrounding bees have been a big concern for us. But it's not just with the, quote, emergence of colony collapse disorder in 2006. We've actually invested, actually it should say, since 1976, we've invested $2 million in bee research. When we first started on this, it was primarily on how many hives per acre and strength. But since 1995, our focus has been on bee health issues, and we'll touch on that here. And of course, we want to be sure that we have a sufficient supply of healthy hives to pollinate our crop. So far, it's a tight supply and demand situation, but so far we've had enough bees to pollinate and produce crops even with our increasing acreage, but it's something we cannot be complacent about. We are invested in, as I say, bee health research, and our engagement lines up very nicely with the priority research needs that have been identified by a number of people, in particular, and groups. In particular, there was a report that came out, National Honeybee Health Stakeholder Conference report that came out, and they identified bromide and better nutrition in terms of both, well, primarily forage throughout the year, breeding for varroa resistance and more diversity in bee stocks. And then, of course, as you all know, pesticides are a big issue, and we want to make sure that we're good stewards of bees with our pesticide practices. So we're investing a lot in terms of not only issues like what fungicides are impacting bee brood and how can we best manage, or what are the best management guidelines for applying fungicides in general. Another concern we see with beekeeping and the bee industry is that DPR, of course, runs the licensing of pest control advisors for crops here in California. If you stop and think about it, there are no pest control advisors in the beekeeping industry. And I think having that technical expertise to monitor pest disease, and when we talk about pest control, it's not just the fields where the bees are pollinating, but the pest control within the hive. We see there's a big void that can be filled by some technical expertise to give the beekeepers guidance.
What we're doing is keeping an eye on insects throughout the year. After bloom is over, we're looking for leaf diseases. We have a couple of different worms that are going to come in and affect us: peach twig borer, navel orange worm, and also mites. So we're monitoring for those throughout the year. Insect control at whole split. This is the one point in our growing season where we can get the most damage from bugs, and it's mostly navel orange worm, and I'll get into that a little bit later again on IPM. Touched on in-season diseases, keeping control of foliar diseases, and as almonds have begun getting, as we begin planting trees tighter and tighter and really pushing our trees for the highest yields, we've seen kind of an increase in different diseases that we're getting that are new, and trying to learn how to control those through cultural practices and through different materials. Nutrient management, we're watching this really closely. We're back in the old days, we'd throw on a certain amount of nitrogen per year, a certain amount of potassium per year, and that was good. Maybe we'd do it 1 or 2 times. Now we're taking tissue samples throughout the year, finding out exactly what our tree needs at what times, and we're spoon feeding these trees to get the most bang out of our buck, to make that fertilizer most efficient, so we're not leaching fertilizer down through the root zone. The trees are getting everything that we want them to. Irrigation is important. Don't want to overwater, don't want to underwater, and like I said earlier, with some of these good micro irrigation systems, we can really zero in on giving our trees exactly what we need. A lot of growers have soil moisture sensors in their ground that are transmitting to them all the time through wireless networks what is going on in their soil with soil moisture. It's like a gas gauge on your car. We know exactly what level of water we have at what level of depth in the ground, and we irrigate off of that. Weed management for harvest. You probably know almonds are shook off the tree onto the ground, and so we're actually harvesting trees off the ground. We need a clean ground surface to do this. We can't have weeds on the ground during harvest. You might think that it's a good idea, it helps kind of reduce dust. It does, but that brings up other issues. You have moisture on the ground, having weeds, it gets, you get dew. You can't have almonds that are trying to dry by the sun, sitting in wet grass, weeds. So we try and keep our orchards, as we get closer to harvest, we'll get them cleaned up nice and smooth, so harvest goes smooth.
Because of all the work that has been done in implementation, we've gone from really high levels of orange worm damage to typically less than 1% or less each year. And again, the foundation for that is the orchard sanitation, and we'll talk on early harvest here. Nick has already mentioned the more pressure from the late spring and summer diseases, because we're planting in a tighter pattern and creating a microclimate that needs to be managed culturally and at times with fungicide sprays. And more of an integrated program where we're, again, taking a look at fungicides, cultural practices. We've implemented some disease models for alternaria, for instance, and of course varietal resistance we're also assessing. And then another big frontier for us is application. Here's some new equipment that is being supported by Gabriele's committee, but Gabriele and my committee work hand in hand on this issue.
Yeah, and basically, for those of you who know that we use air blast sprayers, the whole point of that is to push the material into the tree, because you're trying to get things way up there. Well, for pesticides, a lot of the issues is because of off-site movement of pesticides. So can we find technologies to reduce that, and at the same time make it a win-win, because we also have data from the navel orange worm research showing that getting materials into that upper part of the tree isn't that efficient, so your pest control isn't as good. So the dream is to have a win-win there. This is prototype equipment. To do this would mean managing, pruning and changing the way you're managing the orchard, but it's prototype equipment that we're currently trying to see, can we make this work in real life?
As Nick said, we've come a long ways in terms of irrigation and nutrient management, and we've all noted that our yield has increased over the last 20 years, and it's been a package of advances in micro-irrigation and irrigation scheduling, nutrition and fertigation, tree spacing we've mentioned, and then Nick also did mention the minimal pruning. We're really focused on water availability and actually increasing the bounds of where we are in terms of water management, and we're spending a lot of money right now on an interdisciplinary project defining more specifically what our evapotranspiration needs are for almonds, or what are the water demands of almonds. And we're fine-tuning this down to actually taking a look at demands on a regional basis, water demand in terms of percent canopy, and then, of course, from a grower workaday perspective, is the return on investment for high-priced water. And we want to have a regression, if you will, of water applied versus production increase, so that the grower, if he's going to have to go out and pay for $400 to $800 an acre foot, is it going to be worth it in terms of his production increase? This is a then and now slide of where we've been and where we are now with nitrogen management. You see in the 70s and 80s, Nick mentioned this, one or two applications, oftentimes during the dormant season. Now we're spoon feeding and we're matching the demand during the tree growth application. In the old days, it was broadcast or banded, and we used flood irrigation and impact sprinklers. Now we're fertigating. And then you take a look at our advances in nitrogen use efficiency. Back in the 70s and 80s, the best we could do was 50%, and typically is more in the 40s. Now we're up around 75 to 85%, and proud to say we're among the most efficient nitrogen use efficiency of any crop measured. And of course, there are not only production efficiencies on that, but huge environmental gains to be made. So it's definitely a win-win.
And this is just to give you a sense. One thing we have funded is something called a life cycle assessment focused on energy and greenhouse gases. And I have to admit, I kind of sold it to the environmental committee by not talking about climate change, but by basically saying energy is an input into agriculture we haven't thought much about. And we, you know, where is it going? Where is it coming from? Just to understand that. And this is just some data. It's not the most recent, but it gives you a sense that if you look at energy use, irrigation is the largest, and fertilization is the next largest. Now, mind you, that irrigation includes getting water from its original source somewhere in California to the orchard and onto the orchard. So that's not just from the edge of the orchard into the orchard. That's the whole 9 yards. And with fertilization, it's basically going all the way back to the natural gas pumping and the energy involved in that. So really, this is from first principles. But it's been very eye-opening to us to see this. And what I know of other agriculture groups is that where this has been done is that irrigation and nutrition is where the big energy is. And then for greenhouse gases, it's flipped, but it's still those two as the major ones. So I really mention this just because it gives you a sense of where, you know, from a research side, where the focus should be, and for the sustainability program.
We're into harvest now, which we just finished about 2 weeks ago, so I have a life again, get to see my kids again. Remember, we have 2 or 3 at least different varieties in an orchard. They all get harvested at different times also. So we're going through each ranch and harvesting each ranch 2, 3, 4 times. It's not a one and done. I wish it was, but it's not that way. The earlier we can get our almonds ready to harvest, the less chance we have of getting another generation of navel orangeworm. And so we try and get our harvest done early and as quick as possible. Remember, almonds lay on the ground when we're trying to dry them after we shake off the tree, so we have an issue with ants as well, and I'll talk about that later. So we want to get them dried and up as quick as we can. Ensure good drying conditions for quality and food safety. We don't want to have wet almonds laying on the ground, wet almonds going through our plants. That's a plant pathogen food safety issue. So we want to ensure good drying. That means maybe orienting when you're planting your orchard, orienting your rows, going the correct way to get as much sunlight as you can, pruning techniques, letting the almonds lay spread out on the ground, and minimizing dust. This is where the almond industry has come a long way. As you could probably figure, there's no doubt about it, harvesting almonds is a dirty prospect. but we've been able to minimize that with keeping, doing a better job of ground prep on our end. The smoother the surface we have on our orchard floors, and the better job we do of keeping that smoother, the equipment can work better. We're not raking as much dirt into our windrows of almonds when we're picking them up. And equipment manufacturers have done a great job at coming up with new techniques to really lower the dust emissions coming out of their equipment.
When ARB had to put together a baseline of how much PM10 emissions came from different sources in the San Joaquin Valley, they had one study with essentially one data point for an emissions factor of dust, PM10 dust coming off of almond harvest. And that became the emissions factor. Based on that, almonds combined with walnuts was one of the largest sources of PM10 dust in the San Joaquin Valley as an ag source. So the environmental committee funded research to say, okay, is that really true? And after 7 years of research, we have submitted a revised PM10 emissions factor to ARB, and they're basically, yes, this is good because there's multiple data points behind that. And as Nick pointed out, there's also been additional reductions from equipment manufacturers to help with that. It's still a dusty process. I mean, you can still see, I call them the smokestacks going through the orchards, like from our offices at harvest time, but it's less than it was. Early harvest has been mentioned already, and then the handlers can't handle all the almonds right at once.
Our production research committee has done a fair amount of work on best management practices at harvest, both what do you do in the field in particular when there are rains, and how do you minimize any damage to the crop as a result of the rain. And then the other thing is, Gabriele mentioned that customarily a lot of our crop is actually stockpiled, that's that lower picture, in the field prior to hulling and shelling because of capacity of the processing equipment. And we developed guidelines again for food safety and to retain quality, and much of this revolves around moisture management and control and monitoring.
So we're a grower, packer, shipper actually at our operation. Our job is to get that hole in the shell off of that almond so you can eat the meat that's inside. Hulling and shelling is also a dirty proposition as well, and we have on all of our processing equipment, we have operations in place that minimize the dust coming off of our plant operations with bag houses that meet certain specifications. When we're picking up almonds out in the field, you're picking up more than almonds, you're picking up some dirt, you're picking up some twigs, leaves. We have to get all that out of that product through our processing. Sorted for size, for quality. We also have to make sure through this whole process that food safety is the #1 issue. So we're constantly monitoring for pathogens in our plant, taking lab samples. Pre and post handling storage. These almonds can actually stay in our warehouses for up to 2 years under the right cool conditions. We're lucky and we don't have a perishable product or very perishable product. So we have to make sure that where we're storing them are clean from pathogens, clean from bugs, the right environment, temperatures, humidity. And we also have facility insect management. I'm going to go into that later when I talk more about IPM.
We've been funding research, and just last week had a meeting at our office to try and say where are we now, and I'm pleased to say that we have the first draft of an almond DNDC model. That's the denitrification decomposition model that ARB has been using to sort of assess carbon offsets, carbon emissions from ag situations. And that's building on data for nitrous oxide emissions from almond orchards under different conditions based on actually decades of research on how carbon is allocated in trees, more recently a tree growth model, trying to look at is there carbon sequestration in the soil. So that's where we are on that side. What we're trying to figure out is what to do with this, because to be honest with you, the regulatory side of getting a carbon offset is so onerous that we're wondering if it's worth it. But that's a decision that still needs to be made. We also, as I mentioned, have a life cycle assessment, and that was talked about last week. And what I thought was interesting in there was, as I say, the data I showed you is just for all the inputs. But if you start looking at what you do with the tree removals, what you do with the tree prunings, we also have the almond shells. Almond hulls are valuable cattle feed, but the almond shells is essentially biomass that's been collected at the hull or shellers. Based on that, when they assume that 95% of the tree removals go to a cogeneration facility, as we have them now, that basically offsets 70% of those greenhouse gas emissions that you saw earlier, for the whole life cycle of that orchard. And if you assume that some of that tree removal went to gasification and you generated biochar, they actually calculated a net sequestration. That's the future. There's issues at the moment because I don't see how we're going to get gasifications in the San Joaquin Valley, so I don't know how we're going to get biochar. But just saying that's what the models are saying, which was interesting for us. This is something that got started 6-7 years ago. Actually, when I joined the Almond Board, my predecessor had already started to work on sustainability, had come up with a definition of sustainability that worked for almonds, and then it was said, you figure out what to do with this. And what we came up with was basically somewhat in line of what the wine grape growers have done, is based a self-assessment, asking growers to say which of the practices are they doing. And then based on that assessment, these are examples of the modules, provide growers data comparing how they do with other growers, compared to what the opportunities are. The growers then have an opportunity to look at and say, do I want to change anything in my operation? And you have that cycle of continuous improvement, which, mind you, is actually something almond growers have been doing all along. All this research we've been talking about, growers have been implementing. That means they have been doing this cycle of continuous improvement. So currently we have 5 modules, hit escape, 5 modules. We have 3 additional modules drafted, and the human resources is next. But there's been irrigation management, nutrient management, energy, pest management, air quality. Participation, we've been having growers fill out assessments now for 4 years. We have had about 693 total assessments, that's individual modules submitted. And that represents 95,000 actual acres assessed. I should say that each assessment is based on what are you doing in a particular orchard or block. It's not for the whole operation, because like if you do irrigation management, I'm sure Nick has some orchards that may be still on drip, some that are on micro. You can't answer the questions well if you don't do it block by block. Here are examples of workshops where growers are sitting down and filling out assessments. We also now have an online version for participating. You're getting a preview of the first almond sustainability report that will be coming out at our annual conference in 4 weeks here in Sacramento. And that report will have 2 parts. It has what we're calling the sustainability report, and it has the repository. I'm going to talk about the repository first for a moment. That's where we just have the answers, how many said yes, how many no, to each practice. And there's over 430 practices in here. So we didn't want to just dump all that data on you guys and say, here it is. Working with the consultants, Sure Harvest, they came up with a way. So 2 things that we did for the actual report is, one is the modules are by more what a grower's thinking about. How do I irrigate? How do I manage my nutrients? How do I manage my pests? But when we think about how we get asked questions, it's more like, what are you doing about bees? What are you doing about water quality, water amount? What are you doing about nitrogen management? It doesn't necessarily fit into those nice categories. So we went through all of the modules and looked at each practice and say, does it have a role in one of these media, meaning air, water, energy, land, and land is pest management, nutrient management, or bees, and then went through and evaluated each practice for its relative impact on the environment or on grower economics. And then the next step of the report is to focus on the top 6 practices growers are doing, and the top 6 practices with an impact that growers are not doing, and viewing those as opportunities. Just to explain how the actual modules are, we have a few questions that ask for exactly how much, like how much nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium are you putting on. Those are metric questions. That's actually the rare question. Most questions are basically asking, are you doing a practice, like if you're using compost manure, yes or no. But then we divvy up the no into never heard of it, haven't tried it, or I've tried it but I don't use it, because that gives us information, gives extension information. Where do we need to focus any outreach if that's an area we think we need to do outreach in? This is essentially an example of the repository data. It will be actually more easily read than this, but it gives you, for each question, the yes and no, the percentages, along with the statistical analysis, and then also breaks it down into the not familiar. So you're going to have all the data available in that repository. This is an example from the report, just landed in my inbox yesterday conveniently, the final draft. For water, we actually divvied it up into quantity and quality. So these are the 6 practices that growers are implementing with the most impact on the environment. And here are the 6 ones we rated related to water quantity that have the most impact, but the least number of growers are doing. And same for quality. So this gives you a sense of how the report is. What I thought was interesting here is, for example, when you get to water quantity and water quality strengths, you see irrigation fertilization is the top practice for both of them. And that comes back to it has the most environmental impact. Better growers manage water and fertilization, that has the most impact. That's pretty much our top practice for energy and for air quality as well. So one thing I think is interesting is seeing the interrelatedness of practices through this analysis. And as I say, you'll see things where you're kind of going, well, where's my cover cropping fitting in, or specialty crop, specialty spray equipment. So the diversity of practices that have an impact, we're trying to highlight on this. It's still an excerpt of all the data, but it gives you a sense of where the industry is right now. To get this, show up at the annual conference, December 3rd and 4th. Brian and I were on a committee where the magic wand question got asked last Monday. This is our internal magic wand list, just to give you a sense of the range of issues, both production and because of environmental regulations or food safety issues, we would like to see, we would like to have a magic wand. Now, Almond Conference is here at the Convention Center, so down the street, December 3rd through 5th. The report, the sustainability report, will be coming out in the afternoon. We have a presentation on the afternoon of the 4th. But we also have workshops on irrigation management, nutrient management, and update on all of our pest management as part of that workshop. So I certainly encourage you. Attendance is free. Meals are not, but attendance is free. Thank you.